This presentation introduces some basic ideas about oral history and collections and archives, digital and analog. What happens to oral history when it is made part of a collection or deposited in an archive? First, some basic definitions to help us conceptualize. What is an archive? An archive is a collection of historical documents or records providing information about a place, institution, or group of people. In short, it's a place where people go to find information, but a particular kind of information. Information embodied in first-hand data, facts, evidence from letters, reports, notes, memos, photographs, audio and visual recordings, and other primary sources. Historical objects. An archive is a group of documents that was brought together for a specific reason. This could have been in antiquity, at an earlier point in time, or at a later date by a curator or a scholar. In short, the archive is the historical record. But because it is also the result of a bringing together of materials, it's always partial and shaped by the processes of collection. So an archive may have been discovered together or preserved in a single location unearthed by archaeologists, or it may be the result of a scholarly reconstruction of links between ancient documents or more recent documents. But the point is that it's a collection, something that's been brought together as a collection. And through the process of collection, it is both a whole, but also it is a partial whole, because it's been shaped by whatever criteria was used to put that collection together. So what is a collection? Well, the main point is that a collection comes to exist by means of the principle of organization. That is, a collection has a criteria for inclusion. We decide to build a collection. We're going to collect things of a similar type, and we determine as the collector what that similarity is. As a result, the collection replaces whatever history or origin of the object has with its classification within the collection. Collections are cataloged, and a full catalog record is always created to allow for the integration of that item into the collection according to the new set of values that's imposed by the collector or the creator. So even though we think of cataloging as being a kind of neutral, data-driven process, in fact, it's also a kind of interpretation, because in order to assemble a collection and catalog it, you have to anticipate how it's being used, what its meanings might be. The other thing about a collection is that the collection is itself a new kind of context, right? So if something becomes part of a collection, it's not somehow restoring it to its original origins or its original context, but rather situating it within the context of the collection itself. So each of the individual items within a collection don't necessarily have meaning in and of themselves. If they're part of a collection, they have meaning in relation to their position within the collection. Now, why is this important? It's important because when we bring something into a collection, we are determining by a process of some kind of reconstruction what its meaning is. So what happens to oral histories when they become part of collections or when they're deposited in an archive? Like other objects, their significance, their meaning, in part gets redefined by their place in the collection. And when we archive oral histories, we potentially decontextualize them. They get cataloged, accessed through categories of knowledge as a kind of content filter. So we see what we're looking for. And if you think about a search engine, what a search engine does, when you type a keyword into the catalog, digital catalog, or into a search engine, or in the old days when you would look things up in a card catalog, you're looking for specific categories of knowledge that index this oral history. This is in part defining what its potential meanings might be. And in doing so, we run the risk of foregrounding the interview or the narrative as information as opposed to expression. Narrative becomes data. Now, why is this important? It's important in part because we talked earlier in the semester about how we were kind of moving in oral history away from a positivistic kind of history in which history was data, evidence, information, truth, right, to an idea of history as meaning making. So when we move oral history into the archives and then catalog it, in a way, we are moving, or at least nudging back towards that more positivistic idea of the oral history, the story as data or information. This is the point that Schneider makes in their piece. When we digitize oral histories and catalog them as part of a digital collection, then this treatment of the narrative as data becomes augmented or increased. Some of this has to do with the inherent features of digital media itself. Digital media is basically nonlinear. And if we think about the way hypertext works, it works in a nonlinear fashion. You can jump from something to something to something. There's no clear path through the information. You can take your own path in some way if you follow the hyperlinks. So hypertext itself is multilinear. It really operates around nodes or links, networks of information versus a chronological or straightforward linear narrative. It allows us to move around in space and time in a way that we don't normally get to do. And the digital realm is essentially an open arena. This has a good side in that we can be very inclusive in terms of what can be included, but also can present challenges in terms of difficulty verifying information. We require certain kinds of authentication. Also, if we think of narrative as being reduced to a specific set of data, then sometimes there can be a lack of interpretation or control over how those individual components get interpreted. Part of the value of this as a researcher or a user in the digital realm is that this kind of way of organizing information encourages customization. It allows us to investigate, explore, pursue particular associations, make comparisons. We get immersed in the information and the data. We explore. We even sort of play with ideas in a way that we don't necessarily get to do in a strictly textual realm. And this also allows us to create new categories of knowledge. It can encourage collaboration. It can allow for dialogue, even though sometimes that dialogue can be limited because we also know that digital media is constrained by access to broadband, Wi-Fi, certain kinds of technology, and we know that there's still a digital divide. So this does become somewhat of an issue if we're working with communities who may not, in fact, be able to access the narratives that we collect from them. Ultimately, in the digital environment, narrative is deconstructed into data, hopefully not destructed. And here we can see Eleanor Maze's piece in terms of that deconstruction versus destruction idea. And one of the primary ways in which digital media gets deconstructed is through metadata. Metadata is what makes oral histories accessible, searchable, right? So metadata is essentially the codification of relationships between objects in a collection, associating particular attributes with each data item. Metadata can be structural. It can create relationships between multiple files, such as page order. It can be descriptive. This is keywords or tags. It can suggest the intellectual content of a particular object. Or it can be administrative. This might have to do with copyright or provenance. Who owns the oral history? Who has the right to reproduce the oral history? Are there particular restrictions on that oral history? So metadata involves everything from file naming, creating file names, to creating relationships between files. It allows for discovery because of the association of certain keywords, everything from the date of creation to the people involved, the topics covered. It allows oral histories to be searched for and to be retrieved from collections, and allows the researcher to create relationships between different interviews based on their shared metadata. Metadata also enables the functioning of digital asset management systems, which allows for interoperability. What do I mean by that? This means that different systems, different content management systems can speak to each other and share resources. It's what allows us to do a search across multiple different collections within a specific search engine, or for multiple collections to be brought together within an umbrella. So this might be, there are different conventions for doing this, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the whole idea of metadata, data about data, the association of specific attributes or key data points with an object that allow it to be associated with other objects in a collection or across collections. Welsh oral histories are ultimately cataloged within Dublin Core. Dublin Core is a specific metadata element set that was created to catalog things like oral history and other kinds of cultural historical objects. There are 15 core elements that constitute Dublin Core, so if you're working in something like Omeka or some other kinds of content management systems or cataloging systems, you'll see that you are required to create information for each of these different fields. So some of these are very basic: title, creator, subject, description, publisher, contributor, the date, the type, the format. Was it an MP3? Is it a WAV, etc.? Other kinds of identifiers, language, relation, coverage, and significantly for oral history, rights. Who owns the rights to this material? Now, something like Dublin Core allows us to organize information in a collection so that it can be searched and used. Metadata is also key to the idea of interoperability, the idea that we can create relationships between collections or content management systems, data management systems. This allows us to kind of go into the realm of big data, where we can do a quantitative analysis of large sets of objects, or a qualitative textual analysis of large collections of texts. We can look for tropes, we can look for recurring terms, we can process these narratives as textual data. Again, kind of going back to this idea of the interview narrative as information, or maybe a set of key terms or specific kinds of language use, as opposed to kind of open-ended meaning. But this presents challenges, right? Because when we first talked about oral history, we were really talking about meaning-making, narrative, dialogue, this kind of notion that a narrative is co-created by an interviewer and a narrator. So when we think about how we organize and use oral histories, we want to think beyond discovery per se, which is what metadata allows us to do, to contextualization. How can we create digital tools that allow us to contextualize or understand the fuller meaning of an oral history beyond its specific textual attributes or content? So we need to preserve not only the recording, also the transcript, but also some way of understanding the meaning of how the interview unfolded in space and time. This has led oral historians and digital librarians to think about how can we create digital tools that acknowledge, in Sloane's words, oral history's immutable core. And I'd like you to think about what oral history's immutable core is. Oral history is a linear, long-form source. The order in which events are narrated is important. The context is key. And deep listening is central to the whole process of creating the narrative in the first place. So oral history is not merely just experience recorded, not just the kind of terms or information about experience, but also how experience is examined, how experience is understood. Oral history offers us a chance to move vertically down into experience to gain understanding, versus the more popular trend within digital media, which is to skip horizontally from item to item, right, through hyperlinks. So, does digital media ultimately reduce oral history to information? Does it slide us back into positivism? What kinds of tools can we develop that allow us to create more, not only a sense of correlation, but also a sense of how things have unfolded in an oral history interview? This is where tools like OHMS comes in. OHMS is the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. It was developed at the University of Kentucky at the Nunn Center for Oral History. One of the things that OLMS does is allows a user to view or listen to interviews while also simultaneously looking at either an index or a transcript. There are two examples here that are from the Nunn Center. One is from Combat to Kentucky, an interview with Andrew Napier, and then another collection, Going North, interview with Crosby Brittenham. Both of these interviews, if you click on the links you'll see, allow you to watch a video or audio, watch an audio interview or listen to an audio interview while also looking at the index and or a transcript, and you can switch back and forth between them. So I encourage you to visit one or two of these links and look at how the oral history metadata synchronizer actually works. After you've done that, take a look at some of these online oral history collections. You can click on any of these icons, any of these logos, to visit these different online digital collections. As you visit each site, consider some of the following questions. How is the digital interface allowing users to discover and experience oral histories? How is the site and the way it's arranged, cataloged, determining or shaping meaning? How are materials contextualized or organized? How is the oral history's life in the digital realm potentially reframing it? And what are the advantages or disadvantages of each approach within these collections? You'll see everything from the Nunn Center and the Southern Oral History Program to our own Georgia State University Special Collections. If you click on the link there, you'll then want to do a search for oral histories and find some of the oral histories that are located within those collections. Interestingly, in the case of Georgia State, the oral histories are actually part of larger collections, which are not only oral histories, but also documents and other kinds of archival resources, where some of these other collections are strictly oral histories. Think about the difference that makes, and think about how we understand these oral histories in different kinds of contexts, depending on how the collections are presented, cataloged, arranged, and accessed.